Hello everyone, and welcome to our talk where we reflect upon our experiences over the past 3 years with Möbius. My name is Robert Leek, and I will discuss some of the technical details of question design and implementation later in this talk. First, John Meyer will provide some background and discuss our assessment pipeline.
To begin, we would like to acknowledge the contribution to the discussion in this presentation of the following people. Jonathan Watkins is Education Technology Team Leader for the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences. So John and his team provide support to those who use computer-aided assessment within the University of Birmingham, specifically the college. And this college includes hundreds of academic staff. There is myself and Rob, who are academic members of staff within the School of Mathematics at the University of Birmingham. And the three of us have been singled out because at one stage or another, we were responsible for the computer-aided assessment provision at the Jinan Birmingham Joint Institute. So, of course, Rob and I are not the only academic staff involved in the Jinan Birmingham Joint Institute within the School of Maths. We have fellow academic staff who are pictured at the bottom of the slide. Of course, we also need to acknowledge the contribution of our undergraduate interns who assist us with coding up content. So at the Jinan Birmingham Joint Institute, for computer-aided assessment, we use Mobius. This is similar to the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences at the University of Birmingham. However, we note that the School of Mathematics also uses Stack. This is likely a legacy of Chris Sanguin's time in the department. 2017-18 was the first year that the J-BJI intook students, roughly 100 in number. And School of Mathematics staff were responsible for 80 taught credits. In total, this meant designing 16 45-minute class tests and some introductory assignments to form the continuous assessment for our students. Now, regarding content development here, John Watkins' team oversaw this, and I was tasked with learning the ropes to take on the role in the following year. Regrading of assignments, a job that occurred throughout the semesters, was performed by John's team, and again with the view that this would be undertaken by people in the School of Mathematics the following year. Now, at this point in time, in 2017-18, class tests were planned for all years and for the foreseeable future. However, once we implemented this, there were some practical considerations which highlighted that scaling class tests, that is closed book class tests, was risky given the rise in numbers of our cohorts in the coming years. And so this provided a practical motivation to change this setup. I had a personal motivation to change it too, which was that I wanted to move more towards an assessment for learning as opposed to an assessment off learning setup for our continuous assessments. I suppose this meant, in my view, that we'd move more towards open book, large time or long time period assessments with more randomization. Now, the point of perspective was that the longer time period would be less stressful for students, and additionally, they could cover more of the syllabus and in more depth because simply there's more time. So I proposed this idea and it was approved higher up, so we could enact it in the following academic year. So moving on to the 2018-19 academic year, now content development was overseen by myself and regrading of assignments was overseen by Rob and I, with the view that, in honesty, we didn't know how much work it would take and would decide and report back on how much it was at the end. We found out it was quite a lot of work, and we changed things for the following academic year. But that year, Rob and I did all of it. Now, in the 2018-19 year, we had 200 new students, roughly, entering the programme, and School of Maths staff were now responsible for courses in 2 years, totalling 160 credits. Now, year 1 assessments moved to open book, and the year 2 assignments were kept as the 45-minute class tests that were closed book. This was done to keep things simple for new staff because we concluded that closed book class test questions were simpler to write than fully randomized, deep open book assignment questions. And so the view was if staff were writing closed book tests in the first year. They would then gain an understanding of the Möbius system and be able to write more in-depth questions when they have a bit more time for the following academic year. And so this is the model that we've moved towards over time. Okay, so now moving on to the 2019-20 academic year. Me and Rob did report back on regrading, and now regrading is shared amongst the whole team. So now everyone in the team does some regrading, and content development was taken over by Rob, and Rob is still in charge of overseeing the regrading, albeit the actual workload is now shared out. Now, we have 210 new students who started in this academic year, and the School of Mathematics is responsible for 240 credits, 80 of those being Year 3 modules. And again, Year 1 and Year 2, we have open book assignments in this academic year. And Year 3, originally we planned to have closed book class tests, but COVID-19 sort of got in the way of that. So none of us could fly out and teach in person. We delivered the entirety of our teaching this semester remotely, which meant that these closed book class tests had to be switched to open book tests at relatively short notice. So here we provide an overview of the timings of the main jobs related to computer-aided assessment for the J-BJI. We do so to highlight this is a year-long process without much let-up. Now, in July and August, pretty much for the whole month, we have content creation and development. And so this involves all module leads who require new content, the undergraduate interns who code all the questions for them, and some overseeing by the folks who manage all of it. In September, roughly, this is the start of semester 1, so we have to test Möbius and its linkages with Blackboard at VLE. And in addition, from September to December, we run assessments during the entire 16-week teaching period, and this includes assignment setups, running the assignments for students and providing feedback to them when things are unclear, and after assignments are submitted, regrading. Now in November, I've noted that we hire interns, and this is for the period in the winter where we develop content. I've noted this because sometimes it can take a substantial amount of time to actually hire the interns, in particular during this COVID-19 period. Now in December and January, we have 2 weeks, well, one in December and one in January, where we have an intense content development period. And this is really to finish off the things we didn't finish during the summer period in July and August. Now, January, I'll note, is probably the quietest month from my experience of this. And in Feb, we resume semester 2. So we test Möbius again and its links with Blackboard. And between March and June, roughly ignoring Feb, we have a 16-week teaching period with assessments every 2 weeks, which require the same sort of work as in semester 1. And in May, we get to the point where we are hiring interns for the next cycle of content development for the next July and August. And in principle, this cycle repeats itself with some changes each year. Regarding content creation and development, we begin with our undergraduate interns. So after being hired, that is in July, they are given 1 week's training, and typically we hire some new and some experienced interns. The experienced interns help to train the new interns. Now for the interns' perspective on this employment opportunity, their blogs from 2017 and 2018 are available. Now we note that interns in the December-January period are typically taken as a subset of those employed during the summer, and this is mostly because there isn't time to do any training in that period. Now, module leads, in terms of content development, are given an understanding of the functionality of Mobius, and then they're asked to write questions in LaTeX, typically for the interns to code in Mobius. Sometimes there are exceptions to this, and module leads will request snippets of code that they can use to create questions themselves. This may be standard bits of randomization code to generate random versions of questions, or otherwise. Sometimes they've also asked interns to answer their questions about coding in Mobius, essentially providing help for them to code things in Mobius. Ultimately, intern time is allocated to each module lead, and they can use it how they see fit. Most of them use it to ask the interns to code questions, though. Now, typically interns will code questions and test questions too, and generally each question will be tested by several interns. Once this process is complete, module leads will then test the questions, and if edits are required, they'll be sent back to the interns to be edited and retested until the module lead is happy. Once the module leads are happy with the questions, they approve them for use, and the responsibility now lies with the module lead.
Okay, so now I will start talking about the way we design our computer-aided assessments. Over the past 3 years, we have developed the following set of principles that I have put together in a document to share amongst our staff. The first is that we do, wherever possible, try to avoid having multiple choice questions. It's not to say that they don't have their place, of course, in testing lower level skills, perhaps, but if we can get the students to input their own answer, we would prefer that. So for instance, if you expected a numerical answer, there's no reason they cannot type that in themselves. It also avoids reverse engineering the correct answer. So for instance, if you asked for the derivative of a function which had no trigonometric terms, but one of the terms did, a student could rule that out. Thus it is not a proxy for the same type of learning. Secondly, we favour natural input from students. Our students do not encounter Maple itself during their degree, so we do not want to force them to learn Maple or LaTeX syntax, as this is not part of the learning outcomes. These can cause some issues, however. For instance, in my own course, where I teach first-year algebra, including topics such as permutations and cycles, I have written my own parser to understand students' input that would be written the same way they would write it on paper. Next thing is, we give a few randomised versions of each question. However, we don't suggest randomly choosing anything. We need to be careful to ensure that the different versions are of roughly comparable difficulty. For instance, if you generate a matrix, we may fix the number of zeros or have similarly sized determinants. Here is a non-trivial example from my own course. This plot shows the running time for the Euclidean algorithm, which finds the highest common factor of two integers. A small change in input can lead to drastically different running times, as seen in the plot. One final point I want to make: whenever you design any assessment, including in traditional formats, you have to ensure it will be a proxy for the learning you intended. Especially as this is a summative assessment and students only get one attempt, we don't want to conflate the assessment of different skills in an ambiguous way. This is an example of a question and a potential student's response, and I want you to try and think and decide how many marks should the student receive. Give the second order Taylor series expansion of the exponential function about the point x equals 1. The student responded with 1 plus e over 2 times x squared. So, did the student calculate the expansion about the point x equals 0, which the form of their response suggests, in which case only the constant term is correct? Or, they calculated the expansion about the point x equals 1 and expanded the brackets to be in a series in x instead of x minus 1. Doing this, the correct answer would be e over 2 plus e over 2 times x squared. There is also the issue of the missing x term, so should the student have given this term explicitly as 0 times x? If this were a written question, we would hopefully see their working and have an insight on their thought process that in turn allows us to assess their learning more accurately. This question assesses two different skills: differentiating a function even more than once, and the definition of a Taylor series approximation. A better designed question would split the assessment of these two skills apart and allow the carrying forward of errors from one part of the question to the next. Now we move on to the grading section of our assessment pipeline. Whilst the grading process is automated, we still require someone to check over the results for several different reasons, such as misunderstood syntax. There could be unmatched brackets or a missing multiplication symbol, and the Maple engine would raise an error in this case. We don't wish to penalise students for minor syntactic mistakes, provided their intentions are clear. Another issue that can arise is edge cases. different ways of expressing the solution. This is especially the case if there are multiple correct answers, such as a question that requires giving an example with some properties, or if we wish to reward partial marks. No matter how prepared the question writer is, there will always be unknown unknowns, and students can always surprise you. And finally, there may be bugs in the grading code or in other parts of the platform. By regrading, we help to ensure the assessment is fair for all students. Now, it would obviously be tedious to check every student's answer and would render using Möbius pointless. Unfortunately, there is no easy way to summarise responses within Möbius currently, so we use a custom piece of JavaScript code developed by John Watkins and his team to do this for us. This script collates students' responses, tallies them, and for any particular response automates the process of adjusting the marks for all students who gave it, but it is still clunky and time-consuming. The lack of such a feature within Möbius has been brought up as far back as 2004 in the literature. The person regrading will raise any issues encountered with the lecturer and defer to them should any changes need to be made. The regrader collates these together and produces a small report for the lecturer, which can be used to improve and refine the question for future use. The most common of these issues is the misunderstood syntax. In Möbius, if the grading code raises an error, then the output is 0 marks. So Mobius does not distinguish between 0 marks being awarded correctly and the student's response causing an error in Maple. So last summer, I decided to implement a code wrapper for all non-trivial questions that would catch any errors raised by Maple and return a mark of 1% for that question should there be any errors. This helps aid our regrading process greatly, but it is still not perfect. So to conclude, I will summarise some suggestions that we feel should be incorporated into any sophisticated computer-aided assessment system. The first is to allow holistic approaches to grading, incorporating several response areas and allowing us to carry earlier errors made by a student into later parts of a question. In addition to this, having a classification of student responses prior to grading would allow us to debug code and regrade much quicker, as well as giving more detailed insight into our students' learning. Secondly, these systems should be internationalised. This expression here looks slightly odd to us, but these are in fact full-width characters and lenticular brackets that are used in many East Asian countries and in particular China. But they will not be recognised by Maple as they are different Unicode characters compared to the Western forms. Thirdly, the system needs to have natural interfaces for any area of mathematics, not simply focusing on numerics, functions, calculus and linear algebra. For example, from my own course, an ability to interact with graphs and networks by manipulating their individual nodes and edges. Finally, computer-aided assessment systems need to be designed from the ground up with assessment and learning in mind, including the computer algebra system that runs in the background. Currently, Maple oversimplifies students' input, so as a particular example, it is currently not possible to ask for a diagonalization of a square matrix A that is written by the student in the form P times D times P inverse, where the student is actually inputting the 2D notation for P and D. If we use the 2D math input, then their response gets calculated and will simply return the original matrix to the grading code. That's if the student has got the question correct. If instead I asked a student to respond with a 2-element list, PD, for those matrices, then that input would not be natural. And since permuting the eigenvalues in the diagonal matrix would permute the corresponding eigenspaces, answer boxes for each of P and D would need to be linked together, which Möbius cannot currently do. One workaround is to write a custom HTML question, including some form of natural input interface, but we would essentially be reinventing the wheel and creating a new assessment system by doing this. Thank you for listening to our talk. We look forward to your questions.